Every morning this man walked out of his apartment building and into the street with 6 massive German shepherds surrounding him, no leashes, shoulder to shoulder in perfect formation, and not a single person in the neighborhood could explain how. They moved like one organism. This man never raised his voice. He simply walked, and they followed, as if connected by invisible strings. It was beautiful, but it terrified people half to death. The more they watched, the more convinced they became that something very wrong was happening behind that apartment door. Eventually, they called the police, and when the officers finally pushed that door open, they discovered an unbelievable secret. Whispers had started spreading through the town a few weeks earlier when a young man moved into one of the older apartment buildings near downtown. His name was Augusto de Oliveira. He was 23 years old, originally from Brazil, and he carried an air of mystery that made the locals uneasy. He didn't talk much. He seemed awkward whenever he had to deal with people, preferring to keep his head down and his world small. He had no visible friends. Hardly anyone came to visit. He lived, as far as anyone could tell, completely alone, except for the 6 massive German shepherds that had moved with him into a modest apartment. Now, for most people, 1 German shepherd is more than enough to handle. So when the neighbors of Hyannis saw this mysterious young man walking not 1, not 2, but 6 of these animals at the same time, a chill ran through the town. The dogs surrounded him in a tight diamond-shaped formation, shoulder to shoulder, heads held high, and dark eyes locked entirely on Augusto. They didn't sniff the ground or even glance at the other dogs barking furiously behind fences across the street. They moved like a presidential security detail protecting a head of state. Every day the walks drew stares. Some people were so stunned that they asked Augusto if they could take a photo. He would give 1 quiet command, and the entire pack would freeze in formation, still as statues. Then a soft whistle had them moving again, each dog sliding back into its exact position without a second's hesitation. It was extraordinary. Even professional trainers would have struggled to explain it. And what people couldn't explain, they began to fear. How was one man doing this? What was his secret? The more people watched, the darker their theories became. "He must be beating them," one neighbor hissed to another over a backyard fence. "That's the only way you get a dog that obedient." The rumors spread like a brush fire. Before long, Augusto and his silent pack were all anyone in town could talk about. People noticed he never spent time with anyone except his dogs. He was a loner in every sense of the word, a quiet foreigner who had appeared out of nowhere with an army of unleashed animals and a manner that made people deeply uncomfortable. But some neighbors didn't just talk. In the evenings, curious residents began parking outside his building, peering through curtains, straining to overhear anything, a yelp, a whimper, or a raised voice that might confirm what they already believed. A few went even further. They dug through his trash cans, looking for shock collar packaging, empty pill bottles, anything that proved abuse. They found nothing. And somehow that only made them angrier. One neighbor in particular was absolutely convinced that Augusto was using electric shock collars hidden beneath the dog's thick fur. She didn't just whisper about it. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, gathering signatures from across the neighborhood, building a formal petition demanding an official investigation into what she was certain was systematic animal cruelty. Augusto noticed the dirty looks. He heard the whispered accusations. He knew people were filming him from their windows, waiting for one of the dogs to make a single mistake. But whenever anyone confronted him, he said almost nothing. He'd quietly mention that it had taken years of patience and dedication, and then he'd move on. He never once offered to explain himself further, and that silence told the neighborhood everything it needed to know about him. The phone calls to the Barnstable Police Department and Animal Control started pouring in. Suspected animal cruelty, public safety hazard, dangerous animals off-leash in a residential zone. Petition signatures piled up. Angry residents demanded the authorities intervene before someone got hurt. The case was building fast, and Augusto had no idea how close it had gotten. Then, one gray morning, it finally happened. The animal control officers pulled up to Augusto's building. The neighbors watched from their windows, peeking through blinds, some already clutching their phones, ready to record the moment they had been waiting for. They expected Augusto in handcuffs. Some had already rehearsed their "I told you so" speeches. The officers knocked on the door. Inside the apartment, Augusto heard the knock. He didn't move toward it right away. He walked to the back of the apartment first, slowly. He was in there for a moment, long enough that the officers knocked a second time. When he came back out, he didn't rush to the door. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at his pack. "Stay," he whispered. Every dog froze. Not a tail twitched. He straightened his shirt. He took a single breath. And then, finally, he opened the door. The officers stood in the doorway, clipboards in hand and catch poles at their sides. "Mr. de Oliveira," the lead officer said, "we've received multiple complaints regarding the welfare of your animals. We need to come in and inspect." "Of course," Augusto said quietly. "Come in." The officers stepped inside, and what they saw stopped them in their tracks. The apartment wasn't a dungeon. It was spotless. There were no cages lining the walls, no heavy chains bolted to the floor, and no smell of waste or ammonia. The 6 dogs that had sent the entire town into a panic were lounging on the furniture like overgrown house cats. When the officers walked in, the dogs didn't bark or even stand up. They simply lifted their heads, looked at Augusto for a cue, and when he remained calm, they settled right back down. One officer let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But the lead officer wasn't ready to exhale just yet. He had seen clean apartments before. He had seen careful owners who spent hours scrubbing and staging before an inspection. The absence of visible abuse didn't mean the absence of secrets, he believed. He looked at the dogs again. 6 enormous animals sitting in perfect stillness, eyes fixed on their owner with an intensity that bordered on obsession. That kind of compliance didn't come from nowhere, the officer thought. "Check the storage closet," he told his partner quietly. They checked everything: the food supply, the living conditions, the medical records. Augusto answered every question without hesitation, opening every cabinet, every drawer, never once breaking a sweat. That was when the lead officer crouched down in front of Griffin, the largest of the 6, the clear alpha. The officer moved slowly, watching for a flinch, a growl, any sign. Griffin didn't pull back. He leaned into the officer's palm, pressed his broad head against the man's hand, and wagged his tail. He was simply asking for a scratch behind the ears. From across the room, Augusto's voice came quietly. "They're harmless," he said with a small smile. "They're just big teddy bears, completely harmless." He paused. "As long as I'm here." The 2 officers looked at each other. The inspection had found nothing. Not a single citation could be written. The dogs were well fed, healthy, and showed no physical signs of injury or mistreatment. But given the volume of complaints and the stack of signed petitions, the department decided to go further. They brought in animal behavior experts. These experts didn't visit once and leave. They spent several days observing Augusto and his dogs, studying every interaction between the man and his pack. They watched him feed them, walk them, give commands with nothing more than a quiet word or a subtle shift of his hand. On the second afternoon, one of the experts pulled her colleague aside. "Look at the tail," she murmured, watching Griffin pace beside Augusto without being told to. "I see it," he said. She watched for another moment, but neither of them said anything. Their assessment was narrow in scope. They were there to determine abuse, not to evaluate training philosophy or long-term psychological impact. But on that specific question, was this animal being harmed, their conclusion was clear. The investigators compiled their report. The finding was unanimous. There is no neglect or abuse. By every welfare standard they were authorized to measure, these animals were not being harmed. But the question that had launched the whole investigation was still sitting there, completely unanswered. How? The lead officer decided to ask Augusto directly, not as part of the formal inspection. That was done. This was something else, a quiet conversation at the kitchen table while his partner waited by the door. "Where are you from?" the officer started, his pen moving slowly across his notepad. "Brazil," Augusto said. "A farm, small place, far from any city." "And the dogs?" "We always had German shepherds on the property, since I was young." Augusto glanced at Griffin, who had settled near his feet without being told. "I spent a lot of time with them growing up, more time than with people, honestly." The officer looked up from his notepad. "How so?" Augusto was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to give. "I watched them," he said finally. "The way they moved, the way they read each other, who ate first, who the others looked to before they made a decision. You learn a lot if you pay attention long enough." "And these 6? The officer nodded toward the room. "How long have you had them?" "Since they were puppies. All of them." He paused. "They sleep in my bed. They eat when I eat. They've never spent a night away from me." The officer wrote that down. Then he set his pen on the table and looked at Augusto squarely. "So explain it to me. The walking, no leashes, 6 dogs, busy streets. How does that happen?" Augusto looked at him for a moment. Then he said simply, "They don't want to be anywhere else." The officer waited for more, but Augusto didn't offer it. "That's not an answer," the officer said. "It's the only one I have," Augusto replied. He wasn't being difficult. He seemed to genuinely believe it. But whether the officer did was another matter entirely. The animal control officers closed their clipboards. The lead officer walked outside to the small crowd of neighbors still gathered on the sidewalk. "These dogs are in perfect health," he announced. "They are extraordinarily well trained. There is no case here." He paused. "At least, not one we know how to file." The investigation that was meant to prove his guilt ended up proving something else entirely, something that would travel far beyond the quiet streets of Hyannis. Someone filmed one of Augusto's morning walks and posted it online. It exploded. The video went viral in 2013, racking up millions of views as people around the world watched in disbelief as this quiet young man walked through crowded streets with 6 German shepherds moving in perfect harmony. The comments section erupted. "How is this even possible? I can't get my one dog to sit, and this guy has 6 of them marching like soldiers." Augusto de Oliveira went from neighborhood pariah to international sensation overnight. People started calling him the Dog Daddy, and the name stuck. If you're impressed, hit like because the next part changes everything. For a while, it looked like the story was over. But Augusto made a move that changed everything. Not long after, he opened Griffin Shepherd Kennels, named after his lead dog, turning his viral fame into a career, taking in chaotic, untrained dogs and returning them weeks later as disciplined companions. Augusto began filming his training sessions. He started taking on clients with severely aggressive dogs and posting the results online for the world to see. He toured cities, hosting massive public seminars. For the first time, it wasn't just a viral walk through downtown Hyannis. People could see exactly how he worked, and that changed who was watching. It was no longer just amazed strangers hitting share. It was professional animal behaviorists, veterinarians, science-based dog trainers with decades of experience. For the first time, they could see his methods up close, and what they saw alarmed them. Critics pointed specifically to his use of aversive tools like prong collars and harsh leash corrections, and to a technique called flooding that includes overwhelming a dog with the very trigger that terrifies it, over and over, until the animal gives up fighting back. What the crowd saw as a dog finally at ease, the experts argued, was a dog that had simply run out of options. The controversy exploded. A global network of trainers who championed positive, rewards-based methods began organizing against him. They launched petitions. They held protests outside his tour stops. They showed up in comment sections with the same message, repeated over and over. What looks like a miraculous transformation on camera is something far more troubling to a trained eye. Austo canceled tours in the UK, Italy, and Australia amid the growing backlash. He was turned away at Sydney Airport after a visa dispute. He insisted the criticism was rooted in misinformation, that his methods worked for dogs that had exhausted every other option, and that he needed time to clarify his approach before putting himself back in front of crowds determined, as he put it, to bring him down. The debate is still going. It has never been resolved. And depending on who you ask, the quiet young man who once terrified a neighborhood in Massachusetts is either a gifted communicator who built something real with his animals, or a cautionary tale about the difference between a dog that trusts you and a dog that has simply run out of fight. Back in 2013, on those streets in Hyannis, 6 dogs walked in formation through the morning light. Silent, focused, shoulder to shoulder, never straying. That part was real. Everyone who saw it agreed on that much. What it meant, that's the question nobody has fully answered. Thank you for watching. Now we want to hear from you because this story doesn't have a clean ending. The neighbors of Hyannis thought they had him figured out. The world thought the same thing when the video went viral. Then the experts arrived and complicated everything. So where does that leave us? Was what those 6 dogs did every morning on those streets real loyalty, or something that only looked like it? And does it matter as long as nobody could prove they were suffering? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. If this story made you think, share it, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. We'll see you next time.